Picture this: a young woman stands in front of her bathroom mirror at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, holding a small plastic stick that will change 3 lives forever. Her hands shake as she stares at the 2 pink lines that confirm what she's suspected for weeks. She's pregnant. But here's where this story becomes extraordinary. The father of her unborn child has vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a fake name and broken promises. She has no way to reach him, no way to tell him he's about to become a father. Fast forward 8 weeks. That same woman walks into the most exclusive charity gala in Manhattan, hired as a graphic designer to create promotional materials for the event. She's wearing a simple black dress from a department store, standing among billionaires in custom gowns worth more than her annual salary. She's there to work, to blend into the background, to collect her paycheck and leave. But fate has other plans. Across the ballroom, a man worth $2.3 billion notices her. Richard Blackstone, CEO of Blackstone Industries, 45 years old, recently widowed, and one of the most powerful men in New York. He's drawn to something about her: her authenticity in a room full of pretense, her genuine emotion during a speech about children's education. He approaches her. They talk. They connect. For the first time in years, he feels truly interested in someone. What Richard doesn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, is that the woman who has captured his attention is carrying his son's child. The son he hasn't spoken to in months. The son who abandoned her without explanation and disappeared to Europe. The son who has no idea he's about to become a father. This is the story of Emma Chen, Marcus Blackstone, and Richard Blackstone, 3 people whose lives are about to collide in ways none of them could have imagined. It's a story about secrets that destroy families, lies that build relationships, and the moment when truth becomes impossible to hide. What happens when a pregnancy test reveals more than just a baby on the way? What happens when love grows in the shadow of deception? And what happens when a grandfather-to-be falls for the mother of his future grandchild? Before we start this incredible story, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. Emma Chen's life followed a predictable rhythm that Tuesday morning in October. Wake up at 6:30 a.m. in her small studio apartment in Astoria, Queens. Check her bank account on her phone, $1,847.23, enough to cover rent and groceries for another 2 weeks if she was careful. Shower in the bathroom she shared with thin walls that let her hear every argument from the couple next door. Coffee from the bodega downstairs because her coffee maker had broken 3 months ago and hadn't made the priority list for replacement. The subway ride into Manhattan took 43 minutes door to door. Emma used the time to sketch in her worn leather portfolio, the same one she'd carried since art school. Today she was working on designs for a small non-profit's fundraising brochure, pro bono work that wouldn't pay her bills but helped her sleep better at night. She'd learned to balance paying clients with passion projects, though the balance often tipped toward survival rather than satisfaction. At 24, Emma had already adapted to life's disappointments. Her parents had immigrated from Taiwan when she was 3, working double shifts at their small restaurant in Flushing to pay for her education. She'd graduated from Parsons School of Design with honors and $78,000 in student debt. Her first job at a boutique marketing firm paid $35,000 a year, barely enough to cover loan payments and rent. After 2 years of eating instant noodles and walking everywhere to save on subway fare, she'd finally landed her current position at Morrison Creative, where she earned $42,000 annually and had health insurance. The Morrison Creative office occupied the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse in Brooklyn. Emma's desk sat by the window, where she could watch construction workers building luxury condos that she'd never afford. Her workspace was organized with military precision, color-coded folders, pencils arranged by length, a small succulent that somehow survived despite the building's poor lighting. Emma, conference room in 5, called Janet Morrison, the agency's founder and Emma's boss. Janet was 52, divorced, and ran her business with the focused intensity of someone who'd learned to depend only on herself. She'd taken a chance on Emma 2 years ago, and Emma had proven herself through 60-hour weeks and consistently excellent work. The conference room smelled like burned coffee and dry erase markers. Janet spread mock-ups across the table, logos, brochures, website designs. New client, she announced. Big one. Blackstone Industries is hosting their annual charity gala next month. They need a complete visual package, invitations, programs, signage, digital materials. The budget is substantial. Emma nodded, already mentally cataloging the work involved. Large corporate events meant long hours but good pay. She could use the overtime to finally replace her failing laptop and maybe even put something toward her emergency fund. The theme is Building Tomorrow's Leaders, Janet continued. They focus on educational programs for underprivileged kids. Should be right up your alley. Emma had built a reputation within the firm for non-profit and education-focused work. Her designs had a warmth and authenticity that resonated with charitable organizations. When's the deadline? Emma asked, already reaching for her calendar. 3 weeks. The gala is November 15th. They want to see initial concepts by Friday. Janet slid a folder across the table. Everything you need is in here: brand guidelines, past event materials, target demographics. The contact is Margaret Wells, their events coordinator. She's expecting your call. Emma spent the rest of the morning researching Blackstone Industries. The company had been founded 27 years ago by Richard Blackstone, who'd built it from a small construction firm into a multi-billion-dollar empire spanning real estate development, renewable energy, and infrastructure. The company's charitable foundation focused on education, having built over 200 schools in underserved communities. Richard Blackstone himself was something of a legend in business circles. Orphaned at 16 when his parents died in a car accident, he'd used their small life insurance payout to start his first company. By 30, he was a millionaire. By 40, he'd made the Forbes list. The business journals described him as brilliant but demanding, generous but intensely private. The personal details were sparse. He'd married his college sweetheart, Catherine, 20 years ago. She'd died 3 years earlier from cancer. They'd had one son, Marcus, who was conspicuously absent from most company materials despite being listed as a vice president. Emma made notes as she read, planning her design approach. The Blackstone brand was sophisticated but approachable: navy blue and gold, clean lines, classic typography. The challenge would be creating materials that reflected both corporate professionalism and charitable warmth. Her phone buzzed with a text from her grandmother. Did you eat lunch? Your mother is worried. Emma smiled, despite herself. Her 90-year-old Nai lived in the same Flushing apartment where she'd raised Emma's father, and she still treated Emma like she was 12 years old. The daily check-ins were both annoying and comforting. She texted back, eating now. Love you. It wasn't entirely true. She'd grabbed a granola bar from her desk drawer, but it would keep her family from worrying. The afternoon flew by in a blur of sketches and concepts. Emma lost herself in the work, the way she always did when a project captured her imagination. The Blackstone Gala represented exactly the kind of cause she cared about: education, opportunity, helping kids who started life with the same disadvantages she'd faced. At 7:30 p.m., she finally looked up from her computer to find the office empty. Janet had left hours ago, and the cleaning crew was working their way through the cubicles. Emma's neck ached from hunching over her desk, and her eyes burned from staring at the screen. She gathered her things and headed for the subway, mentally planning her evening. Leftover Thai food for dinner, maybe an episode of the British baking show she'd been watching, then bed by 10 so she could start fresh tomorrow. It was a quiet life, maybe even boring by some standards, but it was hers. She'd worked hard for this stability, this independence. The subway car was nearly empty at this hour, just a few tired commuters heading home late. Emma found a seat and pulled out her sketchbook, adding details to her gala concepts. She was particularly proud of the invitation design: elegant but warm, sophisticated but accessible. As the train crossed the Queensboro Bridge, Emma caught her reflection in the dark window. She looked tired, she realized. The stress of constant financial pressure was starting to show in the circles under her eyes, the tightness around her mouth. She was young, but she felt older than her years. Back in her apartment, Emma heated up pad thai in her small microwave and settled onto her second-hand couch. The British baking show was soothing, all gentle accents and perfect pastries, a world where the biggest crisis was a fallen soufflé. She was halfway through an episode about Bread Week when exhaustion overtook her. She woke up at 2 a.m. with the TV still on and a crick in her neck from sleeping on the couch. As she stumbled toward her bed, Emma felt a strange flutter in her stomach. Probably the Thai food, she thought. She'd been having minor digestive issues for the past few weeks, probably stress from taking on extra projects. She fell asleep thinking about invitation layouts and color schemes, unaware that across the city, in a penthouse overlooking Central Park, Richard Blackstone was having trouble sleeping for entirely different reasons. And somewhere in Europe, his son Marcus was making decisions that would change all their lives forever. 8 months earlier, Emma's life had been different. Not dramatically different. She'd still lived in the same small apartment, still worked at Morrison Creative, still worried about money. But there had been light in her world, a brightness that came from falling in love for the first time. His name was Mark. Or at least, that's what he'd told her. They'd met at a gallery opening in Chelsea on a rainy Thursday evening in February. Emma had been there for work. Morrison Creative was designing promotional materials for an emerging artists collective, and she'd wanted to see the space firsthand. She'd been standing in front of a particularly striking abstract painting, trying to understand the artist's use of color, when someone beside her said, "It looks like music, doesn't it?" Emma turned to see a man about her age, maybe a few years older, with dark hair and kind eyes. He wasn't traditionally handsome, his nose was slightly crooked, and he had a scar through his left eyebrow, but there was something magnetic about him. He wore jeans and a worn leather jacket, comfortable in his own skin in a way that Emma envied. "Music?" she asked. "The brushstrokes," he said, gesturing toward the canvas. "They move like a jazz riff. Start soft, build to crescendo, then fade out. Can you hear it?" Emma looked at the painting again, and suddenly she could see what he meant. The colors did flow like melody, building and releasing tension in visual harmony. "You're right," she said, genuinely surprised. "Are you an artist?" "Sometimes," he replied. "Depends on the day. I'm Mark." He extended his hand, and when Emma shook it, she felt a small electric shock that had nothing to do with static electricity. "Emma." They talked for 2 hours, moving from painting to painting, discussing art and life and dreams. Mark had opinions about everything: which artists were overrated, why city planning mattered, how music and visual art shared the same fundamental principles. He was passionate without being pretentious, intelligent without being condescending. When the gallery closed, they walked to a small cafe nearby and continued talking over coffee that grew cold as they lost themselves in conversation. Emma learned that Mark was interested in social justice, that he'd spent time working with educational nonprofits, that he believed art could change the world if it reached the right people. "What do you do?" Emma asked as they finally prepared to leave. "Consulting," Mark said vaguely. "Boring corporate stuff. I help companies figure out how to give back to their communities." "What about you?" Emma told him about her work at Morrison Creative, her love for design that served a purpose beyond profit. Mark listened intently, asking thoughtful questions about her projects and her goals. They exchanged numbers, and Mark texted her before she even reached the subway, "Thank you for seeing the music in the paintings. Coffee tomorrow." The next 6 months were the happiest of Emma's adult life. Mark was unlike anyone she'd ever dated. He was thoughtful, bringing her books he thought she'd enjoy, remembering small details about her work and her family. He was adventurous, taking her to hole-in-the-wall restaurants in neighborhoods she'd never explored, to free concerts in parks, to art installations in abandoned warehouses. Most importantly, he made her feel seen. When Emma talked about her dreams of running her own design studio focused on social impact, Mark didn't just nod politely. He asked detailed questions, offered suggestions, encouraged her to take risks. When she mentioned wanting to travel but never having the money, he planned elaborate fantasy trips they could take someday, researching destinations and creating detailed itineraries that he saved in a folder on his phone. Mark was careful about money in a way that made Emma comfortable. He never suggested expensive restaurants or activities she couldn't afford. When he wanted to take her somewhere that cost money, he paid without making a big deal about it. "I had a good month," he'd say, or my consulting client paid early. Emma appreciated his sensitivity about their different financial situations. There were small mysteries about Mark that Emma chose to overlook because she was happy. He never talked about his family, changing the subject when she asked about his background. He didn't have social media accounts that she could find. His apartment in the West Village was nicer than she'd expected for someone in consulting, but he explained that he'd gotten a good deal from a friend who was traveling abroad. Mark was passionate about education reform and children's programs, volunteering at after-school tutoring centers and donating time to literacy programs. Emma admired his commitment to social causes, his genuine care for kids who needed extra support. They often volunteered together, and Emma loved watching Mark work with children. Patient, encouraging, naturally gifted at making learning fun. "I didn't have the easiest childhood," Mark told her one evening as they walked home from tutoring session. "I want to make sure other kids have better chances than I did." Emma squeezed his hand. "You're making a difference." "We're making a difference," he corrected. "Your design work for nonprofits reaches more people than my tutoring ever will." By summer, Emma was deeply in love. Mark felt like her person, the one she'd been waiting for without knowing it. They balanced each other perfectly. Emma's practicality grounded Mark's big dreams, while his enthusiasm pushed her to think beyond her careful limitations. They talked about the future in careful, hypothetical terms. "When I finally start my own studio," Emma would say, and Mark would respond, "when we have our own place with a real kitchen." Neither said the words, forever, or marriage, but both understood they were building toward something permanent. The end came suddenly, and without explanation. On a Tuesday in late August, Mark seemed distracted during their usual dinner date. He checked his phone repeatedly, barely touched his food, gave short answers to Emma's questions about his day. "Is everything okay?" Emma finally asked. Mark looked at her for a long moment, and Emma saw something she'd never seen in his eyes before: fear. "I have to go away for a while," he said. "Go away where?" "Europe. There's a family situation I need to handle. I don't know how long I'll be gone." Emma's stomach dropped. "What kind of family situation? Maybe I can help." "No." Mark's voice was sharper than she'd ever heard it. "This is something I have to handle alone." "When are you leaving?" "Tomorrow." Emma stared at him. "Tomorrow?" "Mark, what's going on?" "You're scaring me." Mark reached across the table and took her hands. "Emma, I care about you so much. These past 6 months have been the best of my life. But I can't drag you into my family's problems. They're complicated in ways you don't understand." "I don't care how complicated they are," Emma said, her voice rising. "We can figure it out together. That's what people who love each other do." Mark flinched at the word love, and Emma realized with a crushing certainty that whatever was happening, she was losing him. "I'll call you when I get there," Mark said. "When I figure things out, when I can explain properly." But he didn't call. His phone went straight to voicemail. His texts went undelivered. It was as if Mark had simply vanished from existence. Emma spent weeks trying to find him. She went to his apartment building, but the doorman said no one by that name lived there. She searched online for Mark in consulting, Mark who worked with nonprofits, Mark who cared about education. Nothing. She realized she'd never learned his last name, never met his friends, never been given any way to reach him beyond his phone number. The tutoring center where they'd volunteered together had no record of a Mark matching his description. The gallery where they'd met had no memory of him. It was as if their entire relationship had been a dream. Emma cycled through anger, denial, and heartbreak. She replayed every conversation, looking for clues she'd missed. She wondered if anything he'd told her had been true. Had he been married? Running from the law? Living some kind of double life? By September, she'd forced herself to accept that Mark, whoever he really was gone. She threw herself into work, taking on extra projects to fill the hours she'd once spent with him. She avoided the places they'd gone together, deleted their text conversations, packed away the small gifts he'd given her. But she couldn't delete the memories. The way he'd looked at her like she was the most interesting person in the room. The sound of his laugh when she made a particularly bad pun. The feeling of his hand in hers as they walked through the city, planning a future that had turned out to be built on lies. By October, Emma thought she was healing. The sharp pain of loss had dulled to a manageable ache. She'd even gone on a coffee date with a guy her coworker had set her up with, though she'd felt nothing but polite interest. She was ready to move forward. She was ready to trust again, eventually. What she wasn't ready for was the nausea that started the first week of October. Or the exhaustion that no amount of sleep seemed to cure. Or the way her favorite foods suddenly smelled wrong. At first, she blamed stress. The Blackstone Industries project was demanding, and she'd been working long hours. But when she missed her second period, when the nausea persisted for 2 weeks, when her best friend Sarah finally confronted her about how tired she looked, Emma was forced to face a possibility she'd been trying to ignore. Standing in the pharmacy aisle at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, staring at rows of pregnancy tests, Emma felt the last pieces of her carefully reconstructed life begin to crumble. She bought 3 different brands, telling herself she was being thorough, knowing she was really just delaying the inevitable. The next morning, alone in her small bathroom, Emma watched 2 pink lines appear and disappear and reappear as her eyes filled with tears. She was pregnant. 8 weeks, according to the dates. Which meant the father was Mark, the man who'd vanished without a trace, whose real name she didn't even know. Emma sank to her bathroom floor and cried until she had no tears left. Then she stood up, washed her face, and began planning for a future she'd never imagined. One where she'd raise a child alone, where she'd have to be strong enough for 2 people, where she'd have to build a life from the ruins of her broken heart. She had no way of knowing that across the city, Richard Blackstone was reviewing the guest list for his charity gala, or that his son Marcus, the man she'd known as Mark, was sitting in a cafe in Prague, trying to find the courage to come home and face the life he'd abandoned. Marcus Blackstone sat in a small cafe in Prague's old town, staring at his phone screen for the 15th time that morning. His father's latest message glowed accusingly. The board meeting is next week. We need to discuss your future with the company. It's time to come home. At 28, Marcus looked younger than his years, with a kind of easy charm that had gotten him out of trouble since childhood. But beneath the surface charm lay a deep well of anxiety that had been growing stronger each year. The weight of being Richard Blackstone's son, heir to a billion-dollar empire, expected to carry on a legacy he'd never asked for, pressed down on him like a physical force. He'd been running for 3 months now, moving from city to city across Europe with no clear destination in mind. Prague, Vienna, Berlin, Amsterdam, each city offered temporary escape from the expectations waiting for him in New York. But escape, Marcus was learning, was temporary by definition. His phone buzzed with another message, this one from Margaret Wells, his father's events coordinator. The gala invitations need your approval. Your father insists on having your input on the family foundation materials. Marcus closed his eyes and let his head fall back against the cafe chair. The Blackstone Industries annual charity gala, he'd been dreading it for months. Every year, the same performance. Standing beside his father, smiling for photos, giving speeches about the importance of education and opportunity while feeling like a fraud. How could he talk about building tomorrow's leaders when he couldn't even figure out how to lead his own life? The irony wasn't lost on him that he was running away from the very opportunities that millions of people would kill for. Marcus knew he was privileged. He'd grown up in penthouses and private schools, had never worried about money or connections or doors that wouldn't open. But privilege, he'd discovered, came with its own prison bars. His earliest memories were of his father working late into the night, of business dinners where Marcus was trotted out to charm clients, of conversations that always seemed to center around when you take over the company, rather than if you want to take over the company. By the time Marcus was old enough to realize he might have a choice in the matter, the path seemed already set in stone. His mother, Catherine, had been his buffer against his father's intensity. She'd encouraged Marcus's interest in art, his volunteer work with children, his desire to travel and experience the world beyond boardrooms and profit margins. There's time for all of that, she'd told him when he was 16 and panicking about college majors and career paths. First, figure out who you are. When cancer took her 3 years ago, Marcus lost more than his mother. He lost the one person who understood that he wasn't built for the corporate world his father inhabited so naturally. Richard Blackstone was a force of nature, decisive and driven, capable of making million-dollar decisions without hesitation. Marcus second-guessed himself ordering coffee. The pressure had intensified since his mother's death. Richard, dealing with his own grief, had thrown himself even deeper into work and began pushing Marcus harder to step up, to prepare for inevitable succession. Board meetings, strategic planning sessions, networking events. Marcus attended them all, smiled and nodded and played the part of the eager heir, all while feeling like he was slowly suffocating. That's when he discovered the relief of anonymity. Using his middle name instead of his surname, exploring parts of the city where no one knew who his father was, working with non-profit organizations where his ideas mattered more than his bank account. It had started innocently enough, volunteering at tutoring centers, helping with after-school programs, finding genuine satisfaction in work that had nothing to do with profit margins. And then he'd met Emma. Marcus had gone to that gallery opening in February because he was hiding, really. His father had wanted him to attend a business dinner with potential investors, and Marcus had made up an excuse about prior commitments. He ducked into the first warm, public space he'd found, planning to kill a few hours until it was safe to go home. He hadn't expected to find himself genuinely engaged by the art, and he certainly hadn't expected to meet someone who looked at paintings the way Emma did, with complete focus and genuine curiosity. When he'd approached her, it had been out of authentic interest rather than the practiced charm he used in business situations. Emma was everything the women in his usual social circle weren't. She was unimpressed by expensive restaurants or exclusive events. She cared about ideas and causes rather than brand names and social status. She listened when he talked about his volunteer work, asked thoughtful questions about the kids he tutored, made him feel like his contributions mattered. For 6 months, Marcus had been able to be the person he wanted to be rather than the person he was expected to be. With Emma, he was just Mark, a guy who cared about social justice, who was good with kids, who dreamed of making the world a little better. He wasn't the Blackstone heir with all the baggage that title carried. But the deception had eaten at him constantly. Every lie built on the previous ones. When Emma talked about her struggles with student loans, Marcus wanted to help but couldn't without revealing his true financial situation. When she mentioned wanting to travel, he planned elaborate fantasy trips they could never actually take because Emma could never afford them and he couldn't pay without raising questions. Worst of all, he'd fallen genuinely in love with her. Emma's authenticity, her strength, her way of finding beauty and purpose in everyday moments, it had all made Marcus realize what he'd been missing in his carefully controlled life. She made him want to be better, to be honest, to figure out how to bridge the gap between who he was and who he wanted to become. But fear had won in the end. Fear of Emma's reaction when she learned the truth about his identity. Fear of his father's disapproval when he inevitably learned about Emma. Fear of the complications that would arise from bringing someone from outside their world into the Blackstone sphere. The breaking point had come in August when Richard had finally issued an ultimatum. Join the company full-time in September or forfeit his inheritance and position entirely. I won't wait forever for you to grow up, Marcus, his father had said during a particularly tense family dinner. The company needs leadership, and if you're not ready to provide it, I'll find someone who is. That night, Marcus had gone home to Emma planning to tell her everything. His real name, his family situation, the choice he was facing. But when he'd looked at her, so trusting and happy, when he'd imagined the look on her face when she realized their entire relationship was built on lies, courage had failed him. Instead, he'd told her he had to leave for Europe, made up a story about family problems, and promised to call when he could explain everything properly. He'd seen the hurt and confusion in her eyes, had hated himself for putting it there, but he'd convinced himself it was temporary. He'd figure things out in Europe, find a way to come back and make everything right. Except he hadn't figured anything out. 3 months of wandering had only made the situation clearer. He was a coward who'd run away from the 2 most important things in his life, his family and the woman he loved. He'd lost Emma through his own deception and cowardice, and he was about to lose his place in his family through his inability to make a decision. His phone rang, jolting him from his thoughts. His father's name appeared on the screen, and Marcus's stomach clenched with familiar anxiety. Marcus. Richard's voice was crisp, businesslike. Where are you? Prague, Marcus answered, though he'd told his father he was in Vienna. The gala is in 3 weeks. I need you here for the planning meetings. Marcus closed his eyes. Dad, I told you I'm not ready to. This isn't a request, Marcus. This is your family, your legacy, your responsibility. I've been patient with your wandering, but enough is enough. You're 28 years old. It's time to act like it. What if I don't want the legacy? The words came out before Marcus could stop them, voicing the question he'd been avoiding for years. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Marcus wondered if the call had dropped. When Richard finally spoke, his voice was quietly furious. What you want, Marcus, is irrelevant. What matters is what you owe. To this family, to this company, to the people who depend on us for their livelihoods. Your mother and I built something meaningful, and you will not destroy it because you're having some kind of quarter-life crisis. Mom wanted me to be happy, Marcus said, his voice cracking slightly. Your mother is dead, Richard replied brutally. And happiness is a luxury you can pursue after you've met your obligations. You have 1 week to get home and start acting like the man I raised you to be. If you're not back by Monday, consider your trust fund frozen and your position eliminated. The line went dead, leaving Marcus staring at his silent phone in the crowded cafe. Around him, tourists chatted in multiple languages, couples shared pastries, students typed on laptops, all of them living lives that seemed simpler and more authentic than his own. Marcus thought about Emma, probably at her desk right now, working on some project that mattered to her, building a life through her own effort and talent. He thought about the kids he'd abandoned at the tutoring center, who'd been counting on him to show up every week. He thought about his father, alone in their massive penthouse, carrying the weight of the company and his grief without help. For the first time in months, Marcus felt a spark of something that might have been determination. He was tired of running, tired of disappointing everyone including himself. It was time to go home and face the consequences of his choices. But first, he had to figure out how to find Emma and tell her the truth he should have told her months ago. He owed her that much, even if she never forgave him. Especially if she never forgave him. Marcus opened his laptop and began researching flights to New York, unaware that Emma was at that very moment working on materials for his family's charity gala, and that in less than a month, their worlds would collide in ways neither of them could have anticipated. Richard Blackstone stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office on the 42nd floor of the Blackstone Industries Tower, watching the city spread out below him like a living map of ambition and opportunity. At 45, he cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of decades spent making difficult decisions. The office itself reflected Richard's personality, elegant but functional, expensive but not ostentatious. Original artwork from emerging artists covered the walls. Richard had a soft spot for supporting new talent, a habit that had started with his late wife Catherine's influence and continued even after her death. His desk, a massive piece of reclaimed wood from a demolished Brooklyn warehouse, held 3 computer monitors, a photo of Catherine from their wedding day, and a small sculpture Marcus had made in elementary school art class. Richard's morning routine never varied. He arrived at the office by 6 a.m., before even his executive assistant Margaret Wells. He spent the first hour reviewing overnight reports from Blackstone Industries' international operations, then moved on to domestic concerns, construction projects, renewable energy initiatives, the charitable foundation that had become increasingly important to him over the years. Today, however, his usual focus was fractured. His conversation with Marcus the day before had left him angry, frustrated, and, though he wouldn't admit it even to himself, deeply worried about his son. The intercom buzzed. Mr. Blackstone? Margaret is here with the gala planning materials. Send her in. Margaret Wells had been Richard's right hand for 12 years, ever since Catherine had recommended her for the position. She was 58, supremely competent, and one of the few people who dared to speak honestly to Richard when necessary. She entered carrying an armload of folders and samples, her expression carefully neutral in the way that meant she had opinions she was keeping to herself. "Good morning, Richard. I have the updated guest list, the venue contracts, and the first round of design concepts from Morrison Creative." Richard gestured to the conference table that occupied one corner of his office. Margaret spread out the materials with practiced efficiency: invitation mock-ups, program layouts, signage designs, digital presentations. "The designer is very talented," Margaret said, pointing to the invitation designs. "Emma Chen. I've worked with Morrison Creative before, but never with her specifically. These have exactly the right tone, sophisticated but warm, corporate but caring." Richard examined the designs, noting the way Emma had managed to incorporate Blackstone Industries branding while making the materials feel personal and heartfelt. The invitation featured a photograph of children in one of the schools the foundation had built, but the image was artfully integrated rather than exploitative. "She understands the mission," Richard said, genuine appreciation in his voice. "These don't feel like corporate charity theater." "That's exactly what I thought. She clearly researched the foundation thoroughly. The messaging is authentic." Richard flipped through more samples, programs that highlighted individual student success stories, signage that would guide guests through the evening while educating them about the foundation's work, digital presentations that would play during dinner. "I'd like to meet her," Richard said. "The designer. If we're going to work together on the foundation's materials going forward, I want to understand her perspective." Margaret made a note. "I can arrange that. She's planning to be at the venue next week for the site visit." "Good. What's the guest count?" 437 confirmed, 53 pending. "The usual suspects: board members, major donors, city officials. A few celebrities who support education causes. The governor is sending a representative." Richard nodded absently, his mind already moving to the speech he'd have to give. Every year, he stood before this crowd of wealthy, powerful people and asked them to care about children they'd never meet, to invest in futures they'd never see. Most wrote checks out of social obligation or tax considerations. A few, the ones who really mattered, understood that education was the foundation of everything else: economic mobility, social justice, the health of democracy itself. "Any word from Marcus?" Margaret asked carefully. Richard's jaw tightened. "He'll be here." Margaret had known Marcus since he was 16, had watched him struggle with the weight of expectations that came with being Richard Blackstone's heir. She'd also watched Richard struggle with how to reach a son who seemed to slip further away each year. "Richard," she said gently, "have you considered that maybe Marcus needs to find his own way to contribute? Not everyone is built for boardrooms and quarterly reports." Richard's expression hardened. "Marcus has responsibilities. To this family, to this company, to the thousands of people whose livelihoods depend on our success. Personal fulfillment is a luxury that comes after duty." It was an old argument, one they'd had variations of many times over the years. Margaret had been Catherine's closest friend and had promised the dying woman she'd look after both Richard and Marcus. Sometimes that meant challenging Richard's rigid expectations. "Catherine wanted Marcus to be happy," Margaret said quietly. "Catherine wanted a lot of things," Richard replied, his voice tight with old pain. "She wanted to see Marcus graduate college, wanted to dance at his wedding, wanted to hold her grandchildren. We don't always get what we want." The conversation was interrupted by Richard's phone buzzing with a text message. He glanced at the screen, and his expression darkened further. "What is it?" Margaret asked. "Marcus. He's finally coming home. His flight lands tomorrow night." "That's good news, isn't it?" Richard stared out the window at the city below. "We'll see." The truth was, Richard didn't know how to talk to his son anymore. They'd been close when Marcus was younger, before the weight of succession had poisoned their relationship. Richard remembered teaching Marcus to ride a bike in Central Park, helping him with school projects, taking him to construction sites to see the buildings they were creating together. But somewhere along the way, those moments of connection had been replaced by arguments about responsibility and expectations. Richard knew he was partly to blame. He'd pushed too hard, too fast, trying to prepare Marcus for a role that maybe his son didn't want. The problem was, Richard didn't know how to be anything other than what he was. He'd built Blackstone Industries from nothing, had made decisions that affected thousands of lives, had carried the weight of enormous responsibility since he was barely older than Marcus was now. When his parents died, he'd had no choice but to grow up instantly. There had been no time for soul-searching or finding himself. "The Morrison creative team will be here at 2 for the presentation," Margaret said, gathering up the materials. "Emma Chen and her boss, Janet Morrison." "I'll be ready." After Margaret left, Richard returned to his desk and opened the file she'd compiled on Emma Chen. The information was basic: age 24, graduated from Parsons School of Design, worked at Morrison Creative for 2 years, specialized in non-profit and educational clients. Her portfolio showed a consistent thread of work for organizations focused on social justice and community development. But it was her artist statement that caught Richard's attention. "Design has the power to change hearts and minds. My goal is to create visual narratives that help people see possibilities they might have missed, to bridge the gap between those who have resources and those who need them. Every project is an opportunity to make the world a little more equitable." Richard found himself curious about the young woman behind these words. In his experience, most people who worked with charitable organizations fell into 2 categories: those who were there for the networking opportunities and social status, and those who genuinely cared about the cause. Emma Chen's work suggested she was firmly in the second category. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed his lawyer's name. "Richard, we need to discuss the succession planning documents," Thomas Hartwell said without preamble. They'd been friends since college, and Thomas had handled the Blackstone family's legal affairs for over 20 years. "What about them?" "Marcus's trust fund and position in the company. You've made some strong statements about freezing assets if he doesn't comply with your expectations. Are you prepared to follow through?" Richard was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know. Richard, I've known you since we were 20 years old. You've never made an idle threat in your life. But cutting off your only son, your only heir, over a power struggle. Catherine would never forgive you." "Catherine isn't here," Richard said sharply, then immediately regretted his tone. "I'm sorry, Tom. I don't know how to reach him anymore." "Have you tried asking him what he wants instead of telling him what he should want?" It was a fair question, and one Richard didn't have a good answer for. "He's 28 years old, Tom. He should know what he wants by now." "Should he?" "Richard, when you were 28, you'd already been running a company for over a decade because you had no choice. Marcus has choices. Maybe that's the problem." After the call ended, Richard sat in his office thinking about choices and responsibility, about the difference between wanting something and being forced into it. He'd never had the luxury of uncertainty. Every decision had been about survival, about building something that would last, about honoring the memory of parents who'd died too young. But Marcus had grown up with security, with options, with the freedom to make mistakes without catastrophic consequences. Maybe that freedom was a gift Richard had given his son without realizing it. Maybe it was also a burden. His assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Blackstone? The Morrison creative team is here. Send them in." Richard straightened his tie and put on his professional face, but as he prepared to meet Emma Chen, he found himself hoping that this young designer might provide some insight into how to build bridges instead of walls. He'd spent his career constructing buildings that would stand for generations. Maybe it was time to learn how to construct a relationship with his son that would last just as long. Emma stood in the marble lobby of the Blackstone Industries Tower, trying to calm her nerves while Janet checked them in with security. The building was imposing, all glass and steel reaching toward the sky, with a lobby that felt more like a cathedral than an office building. Original artwork covered the walls, and a small placard explained that Blackstone Industries partnered with emerging artists to display their work in corporate spaces. "Nervous?" Janet asked, noticing Emma's fidgeting. A little, Emma admitted. It's not every day you meet a billionaire. Just remember, he's a client like any other client. He has a problem, we have a solution. The money doesn't change the fundamentals. But Emma suspected it did change things, in ways she couldn't quite articulate. The sheer scale of the building, the obvious expense of every detail, the security protocols they'd had to navigate, it all served as a reminder of the vast gulf between her world and Richard Blackstone's. The elevator to the 42nd floor was silent and swift. Emma used the ride to review her presentation notes one more time, though she'd already memorized every detail. She'd worked late into the night perfecting the designs, driven by a perfectionism that went beyond professional pride. Something about this project felt important in a way she couldn't quite explain. Margaret Wells met them at the elevator, warm and professional in a way that immediately put Emma at ease. She was the kind of woman Emma hoped to become, confident, competent, clearly respected in her field. Ms. Morrison, Ms. Chen, welcome to Blackstone Industries. Mr. Blackstone is looking forward to seeing your work. They walked through corridors lined with more artwork and large windows offering panoramic views of the city. Emma found herself studying the pieces they passed, photographs from the schools the Blackstone Foundation had built, sculptures created by artists the company had sponsored, paintings that somehow managed to be both sophisticated and accessible. Mr. Blackstone takes a personal interest in the Foundation's work, Margaret explained, noticing Emma's attention to the school photographs. Every year, he visits at least a dozen of our schools, talks to the students and teachers, makes sure the programs are actually working. That surprised Emma. Most corporate charity work she'd encountered was more about tax benefits and good publicity than genuine engagement. But the evidence of real involvement was everywhere. Detailed reports on student outcomes, letters from grateful families, photos of Richard Blackstone reading to kindergartners and helping high schoolers with science projects. Margaret opened the door to Richard Blackstone's office, and Emma's first impression was of controlled power. The space was larger than her entire apartment, but it felt purposeful rather than ostentatious. Richard himself rose from behind his desk as they entered, and Emma was struck by how much he looked like the photos she'd seen. Tall, distinguished, with intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Ms. Morrison, Ms. Chen, thank you for coming. His handshake was firm, his voice warm but businesslike. I've been looking forward to seeing your work. Emma found herself studying his face as Janet handled the initial pleasantries. There was something familiar about his features, though she couldn't place what it was. Maybe she'd seen him in business magazines or news articles. Ms. Chen, I've been particularly impressed with your portfolio, Richard said, turning his attention to her. Your work with educational nonprofits shows a real understanding of the mission. Thank you, Emma replied, surprised by the personal attention. I believe design can be a powerful tool for social change. When people see compelling visuals that tell authentic stories, they're more likely to care about causes they might otherwise overlook. Richard nodded approvingly. That's exactly what we're trying to achieve. Too many charity events feel like obligation rather than inspiration. We want people to leave the gala feeling genuinely motivated to make a difference. Emma opened her portfolio and began presenting the designs she'd created. As she explained her thinking behind each piece, the invitation that featured real students rather than stock photos, the program that told individual success stories, the signage that would educate guests about the Foundation's work, she noticed Richard listening with the kind of focused attention she rarely received from clients. This is remarkable, he said, studying the invitation design. You've managed to convey both the sophistication our guests expect and the authenticity our cause deserves. How did you approach that balance? Emma felt herself relaxing as she talked about her design process. I spent a lot of time researching the Foundation's work, reading the annual reports, looking at photos from the schools you've built. The sophistication comes from understanding your brand and your audience, but the authenticity comes from the real impact you're making. The design just has to get out of the way and let that impact speak for itself. And these student profiles, Richard said, pointing to the program layout. How did you select them? I didn't want to just show success stories, Emma explained. I included students who are still in progress, still working toward their goals. It makes the mission feel ongoing rather than completed. People want to be part of something that's still happening, still growing. Richard exchanged a look with Margaret that Emma couldn't quite interpret. That's a sophisticated understanding of donor psychology, he said. Have you worked in fundraising before? Not directly, but I've done a lot of work with nonprofits. You learn to think about how to move people from awareness to action. They spent another hour going through the materials, with Richard asking detailed questions about every aspect of the design. Emma found herself enjoying the conversation. He was clearly intelligent and genuinely interested in the work, not just going through the motions of client approval. There's one more thing I'd like to discuss, Richard said as they finished reviewing the materials. The foundation is considering a redesign of our overall brand identity. Our current materials are several years old, and we want to make sure we're presenting ourselves in the most compelling way possible. Would Morrison Creative be interested in that project? Emma's heart jumped. A complete brand redesign for the Blackstone Foundation would be a career-defining project, the kind of work that could establish her reputation in the nonprofit world. We'd absolutely be interested, Janet said quickly. Emma would be the perfect lead designer for that project. I'd love the opportunity, Emma added. The foundation's work deserves materials that really showcase the impact you're making. Good. Margaret, let's set up a follow-up meeting for next week. I'd like Ms. Chen to visit one of our schools, see the programs in action. Understanding the real-world impact will help inform the design direction. As they prepared to leave, Richard walked them to the door personally, a courtesy Emma suspected wasn't typical for client meetings. Ms. Chen, he said, I'm curious about something. Your artist's statement mentions bridging the gap between those who have resources and those who need them. That's exactly what we're trying to do with the foundation. What drew you to that particular mission? Emma hesitated, not sure how much personal information to share. I grew up in a family where education was everything, she said finally. My parents worked multiple jobs to pay for my schooling. I understand how much difference opportunity can make, and how arbitrary it can be who gets those opportunities and who doesn't. Richard nodded slowly. Education was my way out too. My parents died when I was 16, and I had to build everything from nothing. The foundation exists because I know what it's like to need a chance and not have one. There was something in his voice, a genuine emotion that surprised Emma. For a moment, the billionaire CEO seemed like just another person who understood struggle and wanted to help others avoid it. That's why the work matters, Emma said. It's not just charity. It's justice. Exactly. Richard smiled, and Emma noticed how it transformed his face, making him look younger and more approachable. I think we're going to work very well together. As they rode the elevator down to the lobby, Emma felt energized in a way she hadn't experienced in months. This was the kind of work she'd dreamed of doing, meaningful, well-funded, with a client who truly understood the mission. That went well, Janet said. Richard Blackstone doesn't usually spend that much time with designers. He must be impressed. Emma nodded, still processing the meeting. There had been something about Richard Blackstone that went beyond professional respect. He'd seemed genuinely interested in her perspective, genuinely committed to the foundation's work. In a world where corporate charity often felt perfunctory, his passion seemed authentic. As they walked back toward the subway, Emma found herself thinking about the family photo she'd noticed on Richard's desk, a beautiful woman with kind eyes, presumably his late wife. She wondered what it was like to lose someone you loved, to carry on important work while dealing with that kind of grief. She also found herself thinking about the son Richard had mentioned briefly during their conversation. Marcus Blackstone, who was supposed to be involved in the foundation's work but was currently traveling in Europe. There had been something in Richard's voice when he'd mentioned his son, a tension that suggested family complications Emma couldn't begin to guess at. None of it was her business, of course. She was just the designer hired to create beautiful materials for their charity gala. But something about the whole situation intrigued her, made her want to understand the dynamics of this wealthy, powerful family that seemed to have everything except the ability to connect with each other. Emma had no way of knowing that in less than 24 hours, Richard Blackstone's son would be on a plane back to New York, carrying secrets that would change all their lives. She had no way of knowing that the man she'd known as Mark was actually Marcus Blackstone, or that the baby growing inside her was Richard's grandchild. All she knew was that she'd found a project that excited her, a client who respected her work, and a cause worth fighting for. For the first time since Marcus had disappeared from her life, Emma felt like she was moving forward rather than just surviving. Marcus Blackstone's plane touched down at JFK at 11:47 p.m. on a cold November evening. He sat in first class, a luxury he'd stopped taking for granted during his months of budget travel through Europe, and watched the lights of New York spread out below him like a constellation of possibilities and obligations. He'd spent the entire 8-hour flight from Prague trying to prepare for the conversation he'd have to have with his father. 3 months of running had given him clarity about some things, but the fundamental question remained unanswered: what did he want his life to look like? The one thing he was certain of was that he needed to find Emma and tell her the truth. Whatever else happened with his father, with the company, with his future, he couldn't move forward without addressing the hurt he'd caused the woman he loved. Marcus retrieved his single carry-on bag. He'd been traveling light, living out of backpacks and small suitcases, and made his way through the familiar chaos of JFK. His father had offered to send a car, but Marcus had declined. He needed these last few hours of independence before stepping back into the Blackstone world. The taxi ride into Manhattan felt surreal after months of European cities. Everything seemed bigger, brighter, more aggressive than he remembered. The driver, a middle-aged man with a thick accent, tried to make conversation about the weather, but Marcus found himself too lost in thought to respond beyond polite monosyllables. He'd booked a room at a small hotel in the East Village rather than going straight to his father's penthouse. He needed neutral ground for their reunion, space to think without the weight of childhood memories and family expectations pressing down on him. The hotel room was small and anonymous, nothing like the luxury he'd grown up with, but comfortable in its simplicity. Marcus dropped his bag on the bed and walked to the window, looking out at the city that had shaped him and that he'd spent the last 3 months trying to escape. His phone buzzed with a text from his father. "Margaret says your flight landed safely. We'll talk tomorrow. The office at 9 a.m. Marcus stared at the message, noting the tone, businesslike, formal, with no warmth or indication that Richard was happy to have his son home. But then, Marcus wasn't sure what he'd expected. He'd run away from his responsibilities, ignored his father's calls for weeks, and returned only under threat of financial consequences. Warmth probably wasn't warranted. He typed back, "I'll be there." Then he opened a new message and typed Emma's name. His finger hovered over the send button as he tried to figure out what to say. How do you apologize for disappearing without explanation? How do you begin to explain deception that had colored every moment of your relationship? Finally, he wrote, "Emma, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I'm back in New York and I need to see you. There are things I should have told you months ago. I understand if you don't want to talk to me, but I'm hoping you'll give me a chance to explain. I'll be at our coffee shop tomorrow at 2 p.m. if you want to meet." He sent the message before he could second-guess himself, then immediately regretted it. Their coffee shop, the little place in the West Village where they'd had so many long conversations, probably wasn't theirs anymore. Emma had probably found new places, new routines, maybe even new people to share them with. The thought of Emma moving on, of building a life without him, made Marcus's chest tight with regret. He'd given up the best thing that had ever happened to him because he'd been too scared to be honest, too cowardly to fight for what mattered. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by anxiety dreams about business meetings and confrontations with his father. Marcus woke at 6 a.m. feeling gritty and unprepared for the day ahead. He showered and put on one of the few business suits he'd brought with him, navy blue, conservative, the uniform of corporate respectability. Looking at himself in the mirror, Marcus saw his father's son, the heir to Blackstone Industries. The person he'd been trying to escape looked back at him with familiar eyes. The Blackstone Industries building looked exactly the same as it had 3 months ago, but Marcus felt like a different person walking through its doors. The security guards recognized him, nodding respectfully as he passed. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt both eternal and too short. Margaret Wells was waiting for him when the elevator doors opened. She'd been part of his life for so long that Marcus had almost forgotten she wasn't actually family. "Marcus," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Welcome home." "Hi, Margaret. Is he ready for me?" "He's been ready since 7. Go on in." Richard Blackstone stood at his office windows, silhouetted against the morning light streaming through the glass. He didn't turn around when Marcus entered, and the silence stretched between them like a physical barrier. "You look older," Richard said finally, still facing the window. "I feel older," Marcus replied. "Good. Maybe you've done some growing up during your European vacation." The sarcasm stung, but Marcus had expected it. "It wasn't a vacation, Dad. I was trying to figure some things out." "And did you figure things out?" Marcus moved to one of the chairs facing his father's desk, even though Richard hadn't invited him to sit. "Some things. Not everything." Richard finally turned around, and Marcus was shocked by what he saw. His father looked exhausted, older than his 45 years. There were new lines around his eyes, and his usually perfect posture seemed slightly bent under some invisible weight. "You look tired," Marcus said, genuine concern in his voice. "I've been carrying your responsibilities along with my own for 3 months. Yes, I'm tired." They stared at each other across the expanse of Richard's office, father and son, two people who loved each other but had forgotten how to communicate that love in ways the other could understand. "I'm sorry," Marcus said quietly. "I'm sorry I ran away, sorry I didn't call more, sorry I left you to handle everything alone." Richard's expression softened slightly. "I'm sorry too. I pushed too hard, expected too much. Your mother always said I did that." The mention of Catherine hung in the air between them. She'd been the bridge that connected them, the translator who helped them understand each other. Without her, they'd been fumbling in the dark for 3 years. "The gala is this weekend," Richard said, returning to business. "I need to know if you're going to be there, if you're going to give the speech you're supposed to give." "I'll be there," Marcus said. "I'll give the speech. And after that, the board meeting is next week. They're going to want to know about succession planning, about your role in the company going forward." Marcus took a breath. "I want to be involved in the company, Dad. But I want to focus on the foundation. The charitable work, the education programs, the community outreach. That's where I can make a real contribution." Richard studied his son's face. "That's not where the money is made, Marcus. The foundation exists because the company generates profit." "I know that. But the foundation is what makes the profit meaningful. It's what makes this whole enterprise about more than just making rich people richer." "And you think you can build a career on that? Support a family on foundation work?" The question hit Marcus harder than his father probably intended. Family, that's what he'd lost when he'd run away from Emma. The possibility of marriage, children, a life built with someone who understood his values and shared his dreams. "I think I can build a life I'm proud of," Marcus said. "Isn't that what you and Mom wanted for me?" Richard was quiet for a long moment. "Your mother wanted you to be happy. I want you to be successful. Maybe we need to figure out how to make those things compatible." It wasn't a complete victory, but it felt like progress. Marcus allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to be both a Blackstone and himself. "There's something else," Richard said. "The foundation is working with a new design firm on our materials. Morrison Creative. The lead designer is a young woman named Emma Chen. Very talented, really understands our mission. I think you'd like her work." Marcus felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. Emma was working with his father? How was that possible? What were the odds? "Are you all right?" Richard asked, noting Marcus's sudden pallor. Yes. I'm fine." "Emma Chen, you said." "Yes. We're meeting with her next week about a complete brand redesign for the foundation. She's exactly the kind of person we need, someone who really cares about the cause rather than just the paycheck. Marcus tried to process this information. Emma was working on his family's charity gala, had met his father, was being considered for major projects with the foundation. The web of connections felt too complex to be coincidental. I'd like to be involved in that project, Marcus said carefully. The foundation work is where I want to focus, remember? Of course. I think you two will work well together. If only you knew, Marcus thought. If only you knew. As he left his father's office, Marcus felt like he was walking through a dream. In a few hours, he'd hopefully be sitting across from Emma, trying to explain 3 months of deception and abandonment. And she'd been working with his father, creating materials for the family foundation, maybe even developing a professional relationship that Marcus's personal revelations could destroy. The complexity of the situation was staggering. But for the first time in months, Marcus felt like he was moving toward something rather than running away from it. Whatever happened with Emma, whatever she thought of his lies and his cowardice, at least she'd finally know the truth. He just hoped the truth wouldn't destroy what little chance they might have left. Emma sat in the small cafe in the West Village, nursing her second cup of herbal tea and checking her phone every 30 seconds. It was 2:15 p.m., and Mark, or whoever he really was, hadn't shown up yet. She'd been debating whether to come at all since receiving his text the night before. The message had sent her into a spiral of emotions she thought she'd moved past. Anger at his presumption that she'd want to see him. Hurt that he'd vanished for 3 months without explanation. And underneath it all, a small flame of hope that maybe, finally, she'd get answers to questions that had been eating at her for months. The pregnancy made everything more complicated. At 12 weeks now, Emma was past the first trimester danger zone, but she still hadn't told anyone except her doctor and her best friend Sarah. She'd been planning to tell her parents this weekend, to start making the reality of single motherhood official and public. But now Mark was back, claiming he had things to explain. Emma touched her still flat stomach unconsciously, wondering what his revelations might mean for the baby she was carrying. At 2:23, the cafe door opened and Mark walked in. Emma's breath caught in her throat. He looked different, older, more serious, dressed in an expensive suit instead of his usual casual clothes. But his eyes were the same, and when they met hers across the crowded cafe, she felt the same electric connection that had drawn her to him months ago. He approached her table hesitantly, as if he wasn't sure she wouldn't bolt. "Emma, thank you for coming." "I almost didn't," she said, her voice cooler than she felt. "Can I sit?" She nodded toward the empty chair across from her. Mark, she still couldn't think of him by any other name, sat down and for a moment they just looked at each other. Emma noted the expensive watch on his wrist, the quality of his suit, details she'd never paid attention to before but that now seemed significant. "You look good," he said softly. "You look different," she replied. "More corporate." Mark winced. "That's part of what I need to explain." "Then explain. Because I've spent 3 months trying to understand what happened, what I did wrong, why you just disappeared." "You didn't do anything wrong," Mark said quickly. "Emma, nothing that happened was your fault. Everything that went wrong was because of my cowardice, my inability to be honest about who I am." Emma felt her anger rising. "Who you are? What does that even mean? Are you married? Criminal? In witness protection? Because I've run through every possible explanation for why someone would lie about their basic identity." Mark took a deep breath. "My name isn't Mark. It's Marcus. Marcus Blackstone." Emma stared at him, the name meaning nothing for a moment. Then recognition dawned, and she felt like the ground had shifted beneath her chair. "Blackstone," she repeated slowly. "As in Blackstone Industries?" "Yes. As in Richard Blackstone, the billionaire CEO I met with last week about the charity gala?" Marcus's face went pale. "You met with my father? Your father?" Emma's voice rose, causing other cafe patrons to look in their direction. She lowered it to a harsh whisper. Richard Blackstone is your father? Yes. Emma stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I need air. I need to. I can't. She rushed toward the door, Marcus following close behind. On the sidewalk, Emma turned to face him, her eyes blazing with fury. Do you have any idea what you've done? She demanded. Any idea at all? Emma, please let me explain. Explain what? That you've been lying to me since the moment we met? That every conversation we had, every moment of intimacy, every time I shared my dreams and fears with you, you were pretending to be someone else. I wasn't pretending about my feelings, Marcus said desperately. Everything I felt for you was real. The connection we had was real. How can I believe that? How can I believe anything you say? Emma was fighting back tears of rage and hurt. You let me worry about your financial situation while you're probably worth more than I'll make in my lifetime. You let me pay for dinners, worry about whether you could afford things, feel guilty about my student loans. I never wanted you to pay for anything. That's not the point. Emma shouted. The point is that you lied about everything fundamental about who you are. Your name, your family, your background, your entire life story. What was I to you, Marcus? A sociology experiment. Entertainment for the rich boy who wanted to see how the other half lives. It wasn't like that, Marcus said, his voice breaking. I was trying to escape being Richard Blackstone's son. With you, I could just be myself. Just be a regular person who cared about the same things you cared about. But you're not a regular person. Emma's voice cracked. You're exactly who your father is. You're a Blackstone. That's your reality. That's your identity. Everything else was just playing pretend. Marcus reached for her hand, but Emma pulled away. Emma, please. I know I messed up, I know I hurt you, but we can work through this. I love you. You love me. Emma laughed bitterly. You don't even know me. You've never seen me react to who you really are because you never gave me the chance. You made decisions about how I'd handle your truth without ever asking me. You're right, Marcus said quietly. I was scared. Scared you'd see me differently. Scared you'd think I was just another rich kid trying to buy affection. So instead you decided to lie to me for 6 months and then disappear without explanation when things got serious? Marcus flinched at the accuracy of her assessment. I panicked. My father was pressuring me to join the company full-time, to take on more responsibility. I couldn't figure out how to tell you the truth without losing you, and I couldn't figure out how to bring you into my world without everything changing between us. So you chose to lose me anyway. Yes. And it was the stupidest decision I've ever made. Emma stared at him, seeing the pain in his eyes but feeling too hurt and angry to care. Do you know what the worst part is? It's not just that you lied to me. It's that you robbed me of the chance to make my own choices. You decided for both of us that I couldn't handle your reality. You took away my agency, my right to decide what I could accept and what I couldn't. You're right, Marcus said again. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Emma. Sorry doesn't fix this, Emma said. She felt emotionally drained, exhausted by the weight of revelations and anger. I can't do this right now. She started to walk away, but Marcus called after her. Emma, wait. There's something else you should know. Something about my father. Emma turned back, something in his tone making her pause. He likes you, Marcus said. Your work, your ideas about the foundation. He's impressed by you in a way that rarely happens. He thinks you really understand what the foundation is trying to accomplish. What are you saying? I'm saying that you've built a professional relationship with my father based on your talent and your values. That's real, that's legitimate, and it has nothing to do with our personal history. Don't let what happened between us affect your work with the foundation. Emma stared at him, processing this new layer of complexity. You think I'm worried about my job? I think you care about the work, And I don't want my mistakes to cost you opportunities that you've earned. For the first time since he'd started talking, Emma saw a glimpse of the man she'd fallen in love with, the one who paid attention to her dreams, who supported her ambitions, who wanted good things for her even when it didn't benefit him. But it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. I have to go, she said quietly. Emma, please. Can we talk again? When you've had time to process this. Emma looked at him one more time, memorizing his face, seeing him clearly for the first time as Marcus Blackstone instead of the Mark she'd thought she knew. I don't know, she said honestly. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. She walked away, leaving Marcus standing alone on the sidewalk, watching the woman he loved disappear into the crowd of pedestrians. Emma made it 3 blocks before she had to stop and sit on a bench, overwhelmed by the emotional weight of the confrontation. She pulled out her phone and called Sarah. How did it go? Sarah asked immediately. It's so much worse than I thought, Emma said, her voice shaking. Sarah, he's Marcus Blackstone. As in, son of the billionaire I'm working for. The charity gala I'm designing materials for? It's his family's foundation. Holy shit, Sarah breathed. Emma, what are you going to do? Emma touched her stomach again, thinking about the baby whose father was heir to a billion-dollar empire, whose grandfather she'd been impressing with her design work, whose existence would complicate an already impossible situation. I have no idea, she whispered. I have absolutely no idea. Emma sat in her apartment that evening, staring at her phone. Marcus's revelation had shattered her world, but now she faced an even more complex dilemma. In 2 days, she had a scheduled meeting with Richard Blackstone to present the final designs for the charity gala. How could she sit across from him, knowing she was carrying his grandchild, a grandchild he didn't know existed? Her phone buzzed with a text from Richard, looking forward to seeing your final presentation Thursday. Your vision for the Foundation's mission has been truly inspiring. Emma's hands trembled as she read the message. The man who had shown her nothing but professional respect and genuine interest in her ideas was about to become an unwitting part of the most complicated situation of her life. Thursday arrived too quickly. Emma dressed carefully in a flowing blazer that concealed her growing belly and made her way to the Blackstone Industries building. At 14 weeks pregnant, she was starting to show, and the morning sickness had evolved into an exhausting fatigue that made every interaction feel surreal. Richard greeted her warmly in his office, the same genuine smile that had drawn her to him at the gala. Emma, please sit. I've been eager to see what you've created. As she presented her designs, materials that celebrated family legacy, children's futures, and the importance of nurturing the next generation, Emma felt the irony burning in her chest. Every word felt like a lie by omission. This is exceptional work, Richard said, studying the layouts. The way you've captured the essence of building something meaningful for future generations, it's exactly what I hoped for. Emma nodded, trying to maintain her professional composure. But when Richard looked up at her with those kind eyes that looked remarkably like Marcus's, she felt something break inside her. Mr. Blackstone, she said quietly, I need to tell you something. Something that might change your opinion of me and my work. Richard's expression shifted to concern. What is it, Emma? You look pale. Are you feeling all right? I'm pregnant, she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. 14 weeks. And the father is your son. The silence that followed felt endless. Richard's face went through a series of emotions, confusion, shock, realization, and then something Emma couldn't quite identify. Marcus, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes. We dated for 6 months, but he never told me his real name or who his family was. I only found out 3 days ago when he finally told me the truth. Richard leaned back in his chair, processing the information. You had no idea who he was when you started working with me? None. It was pure coincidence that I was assigned to your account. When I realized the connection, I didn't know what to do. Richard was quiet for a long moment, his business mind clearly working through the implications. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured but not unkind. Does Marcus know about the pregnancy? I told him yesterday. He's overwhelmed. He said he needs time to figure out what he wants. And what do you want, Emma? The question caught her off guard. In all her worry about how others would react, she'd barely had time to process her own desires. I want to keep the baby, she said firmly. I want to be a good mother. I want to provide a stable life, even if I have to do it alone. Richard nodded slowly. And professionally, do you want to continue working with the foundation? Emma's heart sank. I understand if you need to terminate the contract. I know this complicates everything. Actually, Richard said, surprising her, it doesn't change the quality of your work. These designs are still excellent. Your understanding of our mission is still genuine. The question is whether you can continue to work with me, knowing what you know now. Emma studied his face, seeing something she hadn't expected, respect. You could have hidden this from me, Richard continued. You could have completed the project, taken your payment, and I would never have known. The fact that you chose to tell me speaks to your character. Over the following weeks, Emma found herself in an unusual position. Richard, rather than distancing himself, became an unexpected source of support. He didn't pressure her about Marcus or the baby's future, but he made it clear that he intended to be involved in his grandchild's life, regardless of what his son decided. I lost my wife 3 years ago, Richard told her during one of their conversations. I know what it's like to face major life changes alone. You don't have to do this by yourself, Emma. Marcus, meanwhile, remained largely absent. He'd returned to Europe, claiming he needed to think things through. His sporadic texts showed he was struggling with the reality of impending fatherhood and the complexity of the situation he'd created. He's running away again, Emma confided to Sarah. Just like he did before. Maybe, Sarah replied. But maybe he's also trying to figure out how to be the man you and the baby need him to be. The charity gala arrived, and Emma's designs were everywhere. Banners celebrating family legacy, programs emphasizing the importance of supporting the next generation, centerpieces that spoke to nurturing growth and potential. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew the full story. Emma attended as a guest this time, her pregnancy now visible at 18 weeks. She wore an elegant maternity dress that Richard had insisted on paying for, saying it was important for her to feel confident at the event showcasing her work. Halfway through the evening, Marcus appeared. He looked different again, more mature, more settled. He approached Emma hesitantly, aware that half the room probably knew some version of their story by now. You came back, Emma said simply. I never should have left, Marcus replied. I've spent the last month in therapy, trying to understand why I keep running from the things that matter most to me. And what did you figure out? That I'm terrified of becoming my father, so focused on success and control that I lose the people I love. But I'm also terrified of not being worthy of the Blackstone name. I've been caught between two fears, and I let both of them paralyze me. Emma looked at him, seeing vulnerability she'd never seen before. What does that mean for us? For the baby? It means I want to try. Not to fix things with us. I know I broke that trust, and it might never be repaired. But I want to try to be a good father. I want to be present for my child in ways I wish my father had been present for me. The next few months brought unexpected developments. Marcus moved back to New York and began working at Blackstone Industries, but on his own terms. He started a social impact division focused on supporting single mothers and families in transition, a project that Richard fully supported. Emma maintained her professional relationship with the foundation while building her own design consultancy. She and Marcus developed a careful co-parenting relationship, built on respect and shared commitment to their child's well-being rather than romantic reconciliation. Richard surprised everyone by becoming the most devoted grandfather-to-be imaginable. He converted a room at his penthouse into a nursery for when the baby would visit, and he spent hours researching everything from car seats to college savings plans. I missed too much of Marcus's childhood because I was building the company, he told Emma. I won't make that mistake with my grandchild. 6 months later. Emma gave birth to a healthy baby girl she named Sophia. The birth brought the three adults together in ways none of them had expected. Marcus was present for the delivery, holding Emma's hand through the difficult moments. Richard waited in the hospital corridor, pacing like any nervous grandfather. When Sophia was finally placed in Emma's arms, Emma looked up to see both Blackstone men watching with tears in their eyes. "She's perfect," Marcus whispered. "She's going to change everything," Richard added, his voice filled with wonder. Emma smiled, exhausted but content. "She already has." In the end, Emma's story wasn't about finding a wealthy husband or navigating high society. It was about maintaining her integrity in impossible circumstances, building a family based on love rather than obligation, and discovering that sometimes the most unconventional arrangements can create the strongest foundations. Marcus learned that running from responsibility only creates more pain. Richard discovered that wealth means nothing without genuine connection. And Emma proved that strength doesn't come from having all the answers, it comes from facing difficult truths with grace and making choices based on what's right, not what's easy. As they left the hospital together, Emma carrying Sophia, Marcus handling the bags, and Richard clearing the way through the crowd of photographers who had somehow learned